The text message came through at 11:47 p.m., and I remember the exact time because I was still staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks above my bed like they were coordinates to a life I somehow missed. My phone buzzed once, sharp and final, and when I read the words, "Don't come back here," I felt that familiar, hollow pressure in my chest. Not shock, not anger, just that quiet, sinking confirmation that something I'd been pretending was still fixable had finally crossed a line. For context, I'm Ian, 32 years old, and for most of my life I've been the reliable one. The one who picks up, the one who figures it out, the one my family leaned on without ever really looking at. Growing up, my mother had a way of making everything sound like a favor. She didn't demand things outright. She framed them as temporary help, short-term solutions, tiny asks that somehow stretched into years. When I was younger, I mistook that for trust. I told myself it meant she believed in me. What it actually meant was that I was convenient. My older sister, Claire, was the golden child. Loud, confident, always certain she deserved more because she wanted more. I was quieter. I worked early, saved carefully, didn't make waves. My mother used to say I was easy, and she meant it as a compliment. I didn't realize until much later that easy also meant expendable. The loan started as one of those tiny asks. Years ago, my mother called me late one night, her voice low and rushed, like she was already bracing for rejection. She said the bank was giving her trouble, that her credit was a mess because of some old medical bills, and she just needed help setting something up temporarily. She promised it wouldn't be long. She promised she'd handle the payments. She promised my name would barely even be involved. I believed her. I was in my mid-20s, newly stable, proud of my credit score, and still clinging to the idea that being dependable would eventually be noticed. I opened the account, not because I was asked directly, but because the silence on the other end of the phone felt heavier than any risk. She needed a cosigner, she said, just to get approved. The account would technically be in my name, but the funds were for her. Utilities. A line of credit to smooth things out. She even laughed and said, "You're not really using your credit anyway." I remember laughing too, even though something about that sentence sat wrong with me. At first, everything seemed fine. Payments were made. Statements arrived. Months passed. Then years. The loan stayed open, rolling over, quietly existing in the background of my life like a room in the house I never went into but was still responsible for cleaning. Whenever I brought it up, my mother waved it off. She was busy. She was handling it. Why was I stressing so much? Claire, of course, never heard about it. She had her own financial problems, but those were always emergencies, always deserving of family support. Mine was just a safety net, something to be used. The disrespect didn't come all at once. It crept in through small moments. My mother would make decisions using that account without telling me. I'd notice balances higher than expected, charges I didn't recognize. When I asked, she'd sound offended, like I was accusing her of something. "I raised you," she'd say. "Why are you acting like I'd do something wrong?" And just like that, the conversation would flip, and I'd be the one apologizing. The night she told me not to come back started with something stupid. A family dinner I didn't attend because I was working late. Claire had apparently mentioned, loudly, that I thought I was better than everyone now, that I was too busy to show up. My mother didn't ask me about it. She didn't call. She just sent the message. Short, clean, final. "Don't come back here." No explanation. No conversation. Like she was locking a door I'd been holding open for years. I stared at the screen for a long time after that. Not because I didn't know what she meant, but because I did. It wasn't just about dinner. It was about control. About reminding me that my place in the family was conditional. Useful only as long as I didn't push back, didn't ask questions, didn't step out of line. That's when I thought about the loan. Not angrily. Calmly. Practically. I opened my banking app, scrolled past my personal accounts, and tapped the one I hadn't touched directly in years. The balance was higher than it should have been. Again, I checked the recent activity and saw several withdrawals from the past week alone. None of them mentioned to me. None of them small. I didn't close it out of spite. I closed it because, for the first time, I saw the situation clearly. I was being told not to come back, but my name was still quietly holding up part of her life. That contradiction finally snapped something into place. If I wasn't family enough to be spoken to with respect, then I wasn't a safety net either. The process was disturbingly simple. A few taps, a confirmation screen, a warning about pending balances. I acknowledged it all. The account didn't disappear instantly, but it was frozen. Flagged. No new access. No more quiet borrowing. I set the phone down and went to sleep, feeling strangely light, like I'd set down something heavy I didn't realize I'd been carrying. By morning, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Missed calls. Unknown numbers. A voicemail from a shaky voice I barely recognized at first. My mother. Calling from a borrowed phone because hers had apparently been suspended. The bank had flagged the balance overnight. Payments bounced. Access denied. Panic, raw and unfiltered, poured through her words, and for the first time, I wasn't the one scrambling to fix it. I didn't answer. Not yet. I just listened, sitting at the edge of my bed, realizing that the door she'd slammed shut might not have been the one she thought it was. I didn't call her back that morning. Not because I was trying to be cruel, but because I needed to sit with the silence for once and see what it felt like when I wasn't rushing to patch things up. For years, any hint of tension in my family sent me into problem-solving mode. Who needed money? Who needed a ride? Who needed a favor framed as just this once? This time, I made coffee, let it go cold on the counter, and listened to the phone buzz itself tired. By noon, the messages had shifted in tone. The first voicemails were frantic, almost breathless. By the third one, my mother's voice had hardened into accusation. She said the bank had embarrassed her. She said she was at the branch and they were asking questions she shouldn't have to answer. She said I had no right to do this without warning. The irony sat there, heavy and almost laughable. Years of withdrawals without a word, and suddenly I was the one accused of crossing a line. Claire texted next, not to ask what happened, but to tell me I'd gone too far. She said Mom was crying in the lobby. She said people were staring. She said if I had any decency, I'd fix this immediately. There was no question of whether something had been done to me. No curiosity about why I'd acted at all. Just a demand to restore the balance so things could go back to normal. They're normal. I tried, once, to explain. I sent Claire a short message, carefully worded, saying I hadn't been told about recent charges and that I'd been cut off with a single sentence like I didn't matter. Her response came back almost instantly. You're being dramatic. She's your mother. This isn't about you. That sentence stuck with me, not because it was new, but because it was finally said out loud. Plain. Undeniable. The next few days blurred together into a pattern that felt familiar but sharper. My mother stopped calling directly and started sending messages through Claire, through an aunt, through anyone who would listen. Each version of the story painted me a little worse. I was ungrateful. I was unstable. I was punishing her for no reason. When I finally did answer a call, she didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask why. She launched straight into what she needed. She said the bank was threatening consequences. She said utilities were tied to that account. She said I was risking her home over a misunderstanding. When I tried to speak, she talked over me, louder and faster, like volume could erase the years of quiet dependence. I told her I needed transparency. I told her I needed to know what the money had been used for. There was a pause then, a tight one, and she said something that shifted everything. She said it wasn't just her. She said she'd been helping Claire, that some of the funds had gone to cover my sister's expenses because she was going through a lot. Rent gaps, credit cards, a car payment that was apparently too important to miss. All of it quietly routed through an account in my name, because it was easier that way, because I wouldn't notice, because I'd never said no before. I remember sitting there, phone pressed to my ear, feeling heat creep up my neck. It wasn't just the money. It was the casual way she admitted it, like this was a perfectly reasonable arrangement I should be proud of. She even said, "You don't have kids, Ian. You don't really need it." As if my life existed in some holding pattern, less valid because it didn't match hers or Claire's. That was the breaking point, even if I didn't fully realize it yet. Still, I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I told her I needed space to think. She took that as defiance. Within hours, the family group chat lit up. Messages stacked on top of each other. A chorus of opinions I hadn't asked for. An uncle saying family doesn't do this to family. An aunt reminding me of everything my mother had sacrificed. Claire posting crying emojis and saying she didn't understand why I was hurting Mom on purpose. What hurt the most wasn't the noise. It was the pattern underneath it. No one asked if the account had put me at risk. No one asked how long it had been going on. The assumption was automatic. If there was pain, it must be my fault. I was the variable that had changed, so I must be the problem. Then came the visit. I hadn't been back to my mother's house since the message telling me not to come, but that didn't stop her from showing up at my door 3 days later. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing there with Claire beside her, arms crossed, jaw set. It felt less like a family visit and more like an intervention staged without my consent. I opened the door, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. My mother walked in without waiting for an invitation, eyes scanning my apartment like she was cataloging what I didn't deserve. She said I was living comfortably while she was being humiliated. Claire chimed in, saying I could at least look sorry. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to keep my voice steady. I asked them to sit. They didn't. My mother pulled out her phone and started reading from notes she'd written. Figures, deadlines, consequences. She said if I didn't reopen the account, things would get very bad very quickly. I asked again for honesty. I asked for statements. I asked for acknowledgement that this had crossed a boundary. That's when the story changed. She said the loan wasn't really mine anyway. She said because the money had been used for family needs, it belonged to the family. She said if I caused trouble, she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of son I was. Claire nodded along, adding that she'd already talked to people. That word stuck out. People. Plural. Conversations had happened without me. The betrayal landed quietly, but deeply. They hadn't just used my credit. They'd already started rewriting the narrative, preparing the ground so that if I didn't comply, I'd be isolated. Cast as selfish. Cut off. I realized then that the "don't come back here" message wasn't emotional. It was strategic. A warning shot. As they stood there, waiting for me to cave like I always had, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't family. It was a notification from the bank. A formal message about irregular activity and a request for further review. I looked at the screen, then back at them, and felt something settle into place. Whatever came next, there was no undoing what had already been revealed. I took a breath, opened my mouth to speak, and that's when my mother said the one thing I never expected her to admit, the sentence that turned the room completely still and made me realize this was about to become something much bigger than a loan. She said it calmly, almost conversationally, like she was commenting on the weather. She said she'd never planned to tell me the truth because she didn't think I could handle it. That from the moment I opened that account, she'd considered the money family managed, not mine. She said I was reliable, predictable, and therefore the safest option. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that if she'd asked Claire instead, Claire would have said no. The room went very quiet after that. Claire didn't even look surprised. She just stared at the floor, arms still crossed, like she'd known all along and accepted it as the natural order of things. I don't remember what I said next. I remember the sensation more than the words. A pressure behind my eyes. A ringing in my ears. That strange detachment where your body is present, but your mind has stepped back to observe. I asked them to leave. My voice sounded flat to my own ears. Not angry. Not pleading. Final. My mother scoffed, said I was being dramatic again, said I'd regret this. Claire lingered in the doorway, like she expected me to stop her, to apologize, to fix it. I didn't. The door closed, and for the first time in my life, I didn't immediately feel relief afterward. I felt empty. The fallout was swift and brutal. Family members stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. I was removed from the group chat without a word. A cousin unfriended me online. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years sent a message saying they were disappointed in me. The story had clearly spread, edited, and polished into something unrecognizable. In their version, I'd abandoned my mother in her time of need. I'd weaponized money. I'd chosen greed over family. It didn't matter that the account was in my name or that no one had asked permission. The narrative was simpler without those details. That's when I hit bottom, not financially, but emotionally. I'd always defined myself by usefulness. Being needed was my role. Without it, I felt strangely hollow, like I'd stepped out of a costume and didn't know who I was underneath. Nights were the worst. I'd replay conversations, wondering if I could have explained things differently, softer, in a way that wouldn't have led here. I caught myself drafting apology texts I never sent. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because I missed the illusion of belonging. The bank review dragged on for weeks. They asked for documentation. They asked for explanations. Each email felt like reopening a wound, but I complied. I provided statements, timelines, written confirmation of what I'd authorized and what I hadn't. It forced me to look at the numbers honestly for the first time. Seeing years of small withdrawals add up into something significant was sobering. It wasn't ruinous, but it wasn't nothing. It was a quiet theft disguised as trust. Work became my refuge. I stayed late, took on extra projects, not out of ambition, but because it was a place where expectations were clear and effort was rewarded without emotional strings attached. My manager noticed the change before I did. She commented that I seemed more focused, more decisive. I didn't tell her why. I just nodded and kept going. There was something grounding about competence that wasn't tied to family approval. Slowly, almost reluctantly, I started doing things for myself. Small things at first. Updating my budget. Closing old accounts I'd kept open out of habit. Meeting with a financial advisor to untangle what had been done in my name. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd handed over without realizing it. The advisor didn't react with shock or judgment when I explained the situation. He just nodded and said, "This happens more than you'd think." That sentence alone lifted a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying. The silence from my family stretched on. Weeks turned into months. Occasionally, a message would slip through from an extended relative, testing the waters, hinting that I could fix everything if I just apologized. I stopped responding altogether, not out of spite, but because I finally understood that any response would be interpreted as an opening. And I was done being an opening. With distance came clarity. I started seeing patterns I'd ignored for years. How praise only came when I complied. How affection was conditional. How my needs were always framed as inconveniences. It was painful, but also oddly validating. The problem hadn't started with the loan. The loan was just the most tangible proof of a dynamic that had always existed. There were still bad days. Days when I'd see a family photo online and feel that familiar ache. Days when guilt crept in, uninvited, whispering that maybe I really was selfish. On those days, I pulled out the documents, the timelines, the facts. I reminded myself that boundaries don't make you cruel. They make you honest. Something else began to change too. Without the constant drain, financially and emotionally, I started saving again. Not just money, but energy. I signed up for a course I'd been putting off. Reconnected with an old friend I'd lost touch with because I was always busy with family stuff. The friendships felt different. Lighter. There was give and take, not just expectation. Then, one evening, months after everything had blown up, I got an email notification that made my stomach drop. It was from the bank again. The subject line referenced a formal inquiry tied to the old account, and when I opened it, I realized the situation hadn't finished unfolding. Not even close. There were discrepancies they hadn't fully resolved yet. Names mentioned I didn't expect. Transactions flagged that went beyond what I'd already seen. I sat there for a long time, laptop open, realizing that the quiet rebuilding phase might not stay quiet for much longer. Whatever had been happening with that account was deeper than I'd been told, deeper than I'd even suspected. And I had a feeling that when everything came into the light, the version of events my family had been telling everyone else was about to collide head-on with documented reality. I closed the laptop without replying, heart pounding, knowing that the fall I thought I'd already survived might have just been the beginning of something much bigger. I didn't respond to the email that night. I learned, somewhere between being cut off and learning how quietly replaceable I'd been, that reacting immediately was how I always lost. My family thrived on urgency, on panic, on forcing decisions before I had time to think. So I didn't give them that anymore. I slept on it. Poorly, but deliberately. The next morning, I read the email again, slower this time. The bank wasn't accusing me of anything. Not yet. They were requesting clarification about a pattern of transactions that didn't align with the stated purpose of the loan. Multiple transfers. Secondary routing. Names associated with deposits and withdrawals that hadn't been disclosed during the original review. Some of those names weren't even family. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. I scheduled a call with the bank for later that week. Not because I was eager, but because I wanted to be prepared. Until then, I started gathering everything. Statements going back years. Screenshots. Old emails. Text messages where my mother casually referenced moving things around or covering Claire for a bit. I didn't know exactly what I was building yet, but instinct told me I needed a complete picture before anyone else tried to finish the story for me. As I dug, patterns emerged that I hadn't seen before. The withdrawals weren't random. They spiked around certain times. Holidays, big family events, periods when Claire was between jobs or had made another expensive decision she couldn't sustain. There were also transfers that lined up with things my mother had bragged about at the time. A renovated kitchen, a short trip she'd framed as finally doing something for herself. None of it illegal on its own, but all of it sitting on a foundation that wasn't hers to use. I also noticed something else. The account had been used as leverage. More than once, payments were made late, then suddenly caught up just before consequences kicked in. It looked less like oversight and more like strategy. A way to stretch access without triggering alarms. A way to keep me technically responsible while keeping me emotionally uninvolved. That realization hardened something in me. Not anger. Precision. I looped in the financial advisor I'd been working with. He reviewed everything quietly, methodically, occasionally asking a clarifying question. When he finished, he leaned back and said there were options. Not dramatic ones. Not explosive ones. But options that put control back where it belonged. He suggested I document everything in a clean, chronological format. He suggested I stop communicating verbally with family entirely. And most importantly, he suggested I let the bank do what banks are very good at doing when presented with complete information. The call with the bank was calm, professional, almost polite to the point of discomfort. I answered their questions honestly. I didn't editorialize. I didn't accuse. I just explained what I had authorized and what I hadn't. I told them when I became aware of additional users of the funds. I told them about the family pressure. I told them about the message telling me not to come back, the timing of the account freeze, the sudden panic afterward. I could practically hear the notes being typed on the other end. They thanked me, said they'd be in touch, and then they asked a question that confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. They asked if I'd ever signed anything authorizing third-party access to the funds beyond my mother. I hadn't. I said so. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. After that, I stopped waiting for messages and started anticipating them. I knew my family would eventually realize I wasn't backing down quietly. And sure enough, the outreach resumed, but with a different tone. Less rage, more concern. An aunt reached out saying she was worried about Mom's stress levels. A cousin asked if I'd thought about how this might look. Claire sent a message that tried to sound conciliatory but landed hollow. She said she missed me. She said this had all gone too far. She said Mom was struggling. I didn't respond to any of it. But I saved everything. I also started talking to people I'd never really talked to before. A coworker whose parents had been financially manipulative. A neighbor who'd gone no contact with family years ago. An old friend who worked adjacent to compliance and helped me understand how institutions think when money and liability are involved. These weren't allies in a dramatic sense. They weren't plotting anything with me. They were mirrors. Each conversation reflected back a version of my situation stripped of emotion, and in that clarity, I found confidence. The real shift came when I stopped thinking of what I was doing as retaliation. This wasn't revenge yet. It was preparation. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was making sure I couldn't be hurt the same way again. Then, one afternoon, I received a notification that my mother had tried to open a new account. Not in my name, not directly tied to me. But the bank flagged it anyway because of the ongoing review and the shared history. The attempt failed. That's when I knew the walls were closing in, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. The messages escalated after that. My mother finally texted me directly for the first time in months. No apologies. No explanations. Just urgency. She said we needed to talk. She said things were being misunderstood. She said outsiders were getting involved, and it didn't need to be like this. I read it twice and noticed what she didn't say. She didn't deny anything. I replied with a single sentence. I said all communication should go through email. She didn't respond. Days later, the bank followed up. They requested an in-person meeting. They said they had uncovered additional inconsistencies and wanted to walk through them with me. They also mentioned, carefully, that depending on outcomes, other parties might be contacted for clarification. The phrase, other parties, echoed in my head long after I closed the message. I scheduled the meeting, took the day off work, organized my documents into folders, not physical ones, digital, time-stamped, indexed, clean. It felt strange, preparing for something this serious without raising my voice or sending ultimatums. But that was the point. The power wasn't in confrontation. It was in letting the truth stand on its own. The night before the meeting, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by quiet I'd once feared. I thought about how my mother had called me predictable, reliable, easy. She wasn't wrong about who I used to be. But she'd underestimated what happens when someone like that finally stops absorbing damage and starts paying attention. I didn't know exactly how everything would unfold after the meeting. I didn't know who would say what, or how far the consequences would reach. But I knew this much with certainty. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be shaped by guilt or fear. It would be shaped by records, by decisions already made, and by a version of me who no longer needed permission to protect himself. And somewhere, not too far away, I was certain my family still believed this was something they could talk their way out of. They were about to learn how little talking mattered once the setup was complete. The meeting with the bank lasted just under 2 hours, and not once did anyone raise their voice. That was the part one remembered most afterward. No shouting, no accusations, just facts laid out in careful sequence, like pieces of a puzzle being turned face up one by one. They showed me charts, timelines, transaction trees. They explained how funds from the original loan account had been routed into secondary accounts I'd never authorized, some tied to my mother, some tied to Claire, and one tied to a business entity I didn't recognize at all. When I asked what that entity was, the compliance officer paused before answering and said it appeared to be a short-lived LLC my mother had opened and dissolved quietly a few years earlier. That was the moment the last bit of doubt evaporated. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't desperation. This was planning. They explained what would happen next. Because the account was in my name and I'd cooperated fully once irregularities were discovered, my liability was limited. Painful, but finite. The same could not be said for the people who had accessed and redirected funds without authorization. The bank would be contacting them directly. Documentation would be forwarded. Certain privileges would be suspended pending review. There would be consequences, not because I demanded them, but because systems are designed to respond when patterns cross specific thresholds. I thanked them, gathered my things, and walked out feeling strangely steady. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just resolved. The fallout began faster than I expected. My mother called that same evening, this time from her own phone, her voice tight and controlled in a way I'd never heard before. She asked what I told them. I said the truth. She asked if I understood what I'd done. I said yes. She said words like betrayal and loyalty and family obligation, cycling through them like they were buttons she could press to unlock the old version of me. They didn't work. When she realized that, her voice shifted, and for the first time, she sounded scared. Claire reached out next, not with anger, but with panic. She said the bank had contacted her employer about a discrepancy related to deposits. She said people were asking questions. She said Mom hadn't told her it could get this serious. That sentence echoed a familiar pattern. Responsibility always flowed in one direction, and it was never toward accountability. I told her I wasn't involved anymore. That whatever was happening now was between her and the institutions she'd interacted with. She hung up without saying goodbye. Over the next few weeks, the family narrative collapsed under its own weight. Stories changed. Timelines shifted. People contradicted themselves. The same relatives who'd been so quick to judge me grew quieter as facts replaced gossip. I didn't gloat. I didn't correct anyone publicly. I just stayed silent and let the process unfold. The practical consequences were significant. My mother lost access to multiple accounts while reviews were ongoing. Utilities were transferred into her own name at higher rates. Credit lines were closed. Plans she'd made assuming quiet support unraveled one by one. Claire had to explain financial gaps she'd never expected to justify. There were meetings, repayment plans, awkward conversations with professionals who didn't care about family dynamics, only numbers. Through it all, I was left alone. And in that space, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter. The final conversation I had with my mother came months later. She asked to meet. Public place. Neutral ground. I agreed, not because I needed closure, but because I wanted to see who she was without leverage. She arrived looking smaller somehow. The confidence she'd always carried worn thin by consequences she couldn't deflect. She didn't apologize. Not really. She said she'd done what she thought was necessary. She said she'd assumed I'd always be there. I told her that assumption was the problem. I explained, calmly, that I wasn't cutting her off to punish her. I was stepping back because the relationship we'd had required me to disappear for it to function. I told her I hoped she figured things out. I told her I wouldn't be reopening anything, financially or emotionally, until trust was rebuilt from scratch. If it ever was. She nodded, eyes downcast, and for once, didn't argue. I walked away without looking back. Life didn't become perfect after that. It became quieter, cleaner. My finances stabilized fully. My credit recovered. I moved into a new place, one chosen entirely for myself. I kept my circle small and honest. I learned how to say no without explaining myself. The guilt faded slowly, replaced by something sturdier. Self-respect. Every now and then, I hear updates through distant channels. Claire changed jobs. My mother downsized. Family gatherings still happen without me, and that's fine. The absence that once felt like punishment now feels like peace. I used to think revenge had to be loud, dramatic, that it needed an audience. I was wrong. The most satisfying kind doesn't require speeches or confrontations. It requires clarity, patience, and the courage to stop participating in a story that was written at your expense. The last thing my mother ever told me that day, just before we parted, was that she never expected things to end like this. I told her neither did I. But some endings aren't failures. They're corrections. And for the first time in my life, the account that mattered most was finally balanced.